The Obsidian Club breathes in pulses of synthetic light. Cold blue streaks cut through the air, reflecting off the glass walls and shattering against the floor. Below the VIP balcony, the crowd is a singular, shifting organism, moving to a bass that vibrates through the very foundation of the building. High above this chaos, Adrian Ivanov remains motionless. He sits in the corner of the booth, his gaze fixed on the sea of bodies below. He does not blink. He does not lean forward. He simply watches. The music swells, a heavy, rhythmic thrum that dictates the pace of every person on the floor. Yet Adrian remains outside the current. He treats the room like a map, his eyes tracing the movements of individuals as if they were pieces on a board. Every person dancing, every person drinking, is a variable he has already accounted for. He is the only one in the room not caught in the rhythm. He is the only one who knows the game. The neon light shifts, casting long, sharp shadows across his face, but he does not shift his position. He waits. He observes. He controls the silence in the middle of the roar. Adrian tilts the crystal glass. The amber liquid catches the strobe light, throwing distorted reflections against the mahogany table. He watches the movement of the fluid, his grip steady, his fingers tracing the rim with a slow, rhythmic pressure. Below him, the crowd is a collection of predictable trajectories. He tracks a man near the bar, noting the way he checks his watch, the way he signals for another drink, the way he leans into his companion. To Adrian, these are not people. They are assets and liabilities. He mentally sorts them, assigning weight to every gesture. The woman laughing by the pillar is a distraction. The man in the corner is a potential leverage point. He dissects the room with clinical precision, stripping away the noise until only the mechanics of power remain. He has built his empire on this exact ability to see the strings that move the world. He does not need to speak. He only needs to watch. The ice inside his glass shifts, a faint, crystalline chime that cuts through the base. He sets the glass down. The bass hits the table with a sharp, final thud. The bass line drops an octave, turning the air into a physical weight. The rhythm that had been a steady, predictable pulse suddenly fractures into a jagged, syncopated beat. Below the balcony, the crowd reacts. Dancers stumble, their movements losing the fluid uniformity they held moments ago. The strobe lights accelerate, flashing in frantic, uneven bursts that turn the room into a series of frozen, disjointed images. Adrian feels the change in the floorboards beneath his feet. The vibration is no longer a hum. It is a tremor. He shifts his weight, his back straightening against the pillar. The predictability of the room has vanished. He scans the floor, his eyes darting from the bar to the center of the dance floor, searching for the source of the disruption. The air feels thinner, charged with a static intensity that makes the fine hairs on his arms stand up. He leans forward, his hands gripping the cold metal of the railing. The music reaches a crescendo, and for the first time in years, he is not entirely sure what happens next. The music settles into a heavy, grinding rhythm that forces the crowd to part. Through the haze of smoke and shifting lights, a figure emerges from the dense mass of dancers. She moves with a deliberate, measured stride that ignores the frantic energy of the room. In her hands, she balances a tray, her wrists locked and steady despite the bodies colliding around her. She navigates the narrow gaps between tables, her path a straight line through the chaos. When a patron stumbles into her way, she pivots with a sharp, fluid motion, her momentum never faltering. She does not look at the people she passes. Her eyes are fixed on the open space ahead. She reaches the edge of the dance floor, where the floorboards are slick with spilled liquid. She does not hesitate. She plants her feet, adjusts her grip on the tray, and pushes forward into the thickest part of the throng. Her movements are efficient, stripped of all unnecessary effort. She stops at a table, her chest rising and falling. She remains at the table, the tray held with a grip that does not waver. Around her, the patrons lean in, their faces slack with the hollow deference common to those seeking favor. They offer smiles that do not reach their eyes, their bodies angled toward her in a display of performative submission. She does not return the gesture. She does not offer the practiced, empty pleasantries expected of her role. Instead, she stands perfectly still, her posture rigid and alert. Her eyes move across the room, not as a servant, but as a surveyor measuring the structural integrity of a foundation. She tracks the movement of the security staff by the door. She notes the intervals between the shifting lights. She observes the way the crowd pulses, identifying the weak points in the rhythm. There is a cold, clinical precision in the way she processes the chaos. She is looking for something specific, something hidden beneath the surface of the noise. When she turns, her head moves with a sharp, mechanical grace. She ignores the outstretched hands and the beckoning voices of the nearby tables. Her gaze sweeps upward, cutting through the haze until it finds the balcony. It does not drift. It locks onto the darkness above with a focus so intense it feels like a physical weight. High above the shifting mass of the crowd, the air in the VIP booth remains still. Adrian Ivanov sits in the shadows, his fingers tracing the rim of a crystal glass. The amber liquid inside catches the strobing lights, casting fractured patterns against the mahogany surface. He has spent years observing the room from this distance, watching the patterns of influence and the subtle shifts in power. He is accustomed to the hollow deference of those below, the way they move with a frantic, unearned urgency. But the rhythm of the room has changed. He feels the shift before he identifies the source. The bass thumps against the floorboards, a relentless, vibrating pulse that usually drowns out all individual intent. He turns his head, his movements slow and deliberate, and tracks the source of the tension. He watches the way the crowd reacts to her presence, the way she moves with a precision that defies the surrounding chaos. He feels the static in the air, a tightening of the space between the balcony and the floor. Then, with a sudden, decisive motion, he brings the glass down. The bass hits the table with a sharp, piercing clink. The sound is dry, metallic, and absolute. The sound of the glass hitting the table lingers, a sharp vibration that refuses to dissipate into the bass. Below, the crowd continues to surge, a mindless tide of motion, but the connection between the balcony and the floor has solidified into something tangible. Valentina does not flinch. She does not look down. She stands amidst the dancers, her posture anchored, her focus directed upward with a clarity that ignores the surrounding noise. She is a static point in a spinning world. Adrian leans forward, his hands resting on the edge of the railing. He searches for the usual signs of hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty that every other person in this room displays when his gaze finds them. He finds nothing. Her eyes are steady, a mirror reflecting his own intensity back at him. The air between them feels thin, charged with a static that makes the skin prickle. He watches her, and for the first time in years, he is the one being measured. She holds his gaze with a defiance that no one has dared show him. It is a silent challenge, a refusal to be categorized or dismissed. They are locked in a singular, private confrontation. The silence between them is heavy, a physical weight that pushes against the surrounding noise of the club. Adrian stands. The movement is slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of haste. He rises from the booth, his frame unfolding until he stands at the very edge of the balcony railing. He does not look away from her. He leans forward, his hands gripping the cold metal of the rail, his knuckles white against the dark surface. He is no longer just watching, he is occupying the space above her. He shifts his weight, tilting his body so that his shadow stretches long and sharp across the dance floor. It falls over the crowd like a shroud, a dark, jagged shape that cuts through the neon haze. He watches the way the light catches her face, the way she stands firm even as his silhouette descends upon her position. He is a predator marking his territory, his presence a sudden, cold pressure in the room. The air thickens, charged with the static of his intent. He does not speak, yet the gesture is clear. He is the gravity in this room, and he is pulling everything toward him. Adrian moves his hand. It is a single, sharp motion, a flick of the wrist that cuts through the air like a blade. He does not need to shout. The gesture is a command that carries the weight of his entire history. Below, the motion registers. Valentina stops. Her fingers lock around the edge of the tray, her knuckles turning pale. She stares up at the balcony. the noise of the club rushing back into her ears, a chaotic roar that threatens to drown out her thoughts. She has a choice. She can turn, walk into the crowd, and disappear into the safety of the anonymous throng. Instead, she draws a breath that hitches in her chest. She sets the tray down on a nearby table with a controlled, steady hand. She turns away from the dancers. She begins to walk. Her path is direct, cutting through the shifting bodies of the crowd. She reaches the base of the stairs. She pauses for a heartbeat, her resolve hardening. Then she begins the ascent. The stairs are a transition from chaos into a vacuum. With every step she takes, the thrumming bass of the club loses its grip, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic click of her boots against the polished marble. The sound is isolated, ringing out against the high, vaulted ceiling. She climbs with a steady, measured pace, her eyes fixed on the landing above. The air here is different. It is cooler, stripped of the heavy scent of sweat and spilled drinks that saturates the floor below. She reaches the midpoint, her lungs pulling in the thinner, filtered air. She stops for a single, silent heartbeat, her hand brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the railing. She does not look back at the crowd. She pushes forward, the final steps feeling heavier than the first. The marble gives way to the plush, sound-dampening floor of the VIP level. She emerges into the light of the balcony, the transition complete. The noise of the club is now a distant, muffled vibration beneath her feet. Adrian remains perfectly still, his presence looming, waiting for her. 3 feet of empty space separates them, yet the distance feels like an unbridgeable chasm. Valentina remains motionless, her gaze level, refusing to acknowledge the gravity of the man standing before her. Adrian leans back against the mahogany pillar, his posture relaxed, a stark contrast to the rigid tension in her frame. He does not rush the moment. He allows the silence to stretch, letting the ambient roar of the club below serve as a reminder of the world she has just left behind. He observes her, his eyes tracing the subtle shift in her breathing, the way she anchors her weight to remain steady against his presence. He is the architect of this room, and every shadow here belongs to him. He shifts his weight, the movement slow and deliberate, and the floorboards beneath him remain silent. He finally breaks the stillness. His voice emerges as a low, gravelly rasp. "You are new here," he says. The words are clipped, stripped of any warmth, carrying the weight of a man who has spent a lifetime. The silence following his observation does not buckle under the weight of his authority. Instead, it hardens. Valentina does not blink, nor does she shift her weight to accommodate the sudden, suffocating proximity of his frame. She feels the prickle of static in the air, a physical manifestation of the tension he radiates, yet she keeps her posture locked. She takes a fraction of a second to steady her breathing, forcing her heart rate to slow until it matches the rhythmic, pulsing bass of the club far below. When she finally speaks, her voice is not the tremor of a subordinate, but the sharp, clear edge of a blade. "I am just working," she replies. The words are clipped, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the hollow deference he has grown accustomed to receiving. Her eyes remain fixed on his, flashing with a sudden, bright intensity that cuts through the dim, amber-tinted light of the booth. It is a spark of genuine fire, a refusal to be categorized or dismissed. For a heartbeat, the atmosphere in the room shifts. The indifference that usually defines his expression falters, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. Adrian does not move to close the distance, yet his presence seems to expand, filling the small gap between them. He raises a hand, the dark fabric of his glove catching the dim light, and holds it steady just inches from her arm. He does not touch her. He keeps the limbs suspended, a phantom weight in the air that forces her to acknowledge the reach of his influence. He watches her closely, his gaze dropping from her eyes to the slight tremor in her hands and the heavy, rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. She is exhausted, the fatigue etched into the set of her posture, yet the defiance in her expression remains unyielding. He has spent his life acquiring things, shaping people into assets, and building a world where every variable is accounted for. But as he looks at her, the silence of the club feels different. It is no longer the quiet of a controlled environment, but the hollow, echoing stillness of a vacuum. He pulls his hand back, the movement sharp and abrupt, as if the space between them has suddenly become too cold to endure. The silence between them stretched, thick and unyielding. Adrian needed to bridge the sudden gap, to return to the familiar language of transaction that had defined his existence for decades. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements precise and practiced. He pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope. It was heavy, the paper stiff and cool to the touch. He did not look at her as he moved. He kept his eyes fixed on the mahogany surface of the table. With a deliberate, sliding motion, he pushed the envelope across the polished wood until it came to a stop directly between them. It was a gesture of finality, a blunt instrument intended to silence the uncertainty. "Take the rest of the night off," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the bass. He waited, his posture rigid, expecting the familiar sight of a person bowing to the weight of his influence. He stood perfectly still, watching for her hand to move. Valentina did not move. Her fingers remained curled around the edge of her tray, her knuckles white against the dark surface. She looked down at the envelope, the paper stark and out of place against the polished wood. The bass of the club pulsed through the floor, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to mock the stillness of their standoff. She did not reach for the money. She did not even acknowledge the command. Instead, she lifted her gaze, locking her eyes onto his with a clarity that made the surrounding crowd vanish. There was no hesitation in her movement as she finally let go of the tray, the wood clattering softly as she set it aside. She did not speak. She simply turned on her heel, her movements fluid and dismissive. Adrian remained frozen, his hand still resting near the table. He watched her walk away, her silhouette cutting through the shifting neon lights until she disappeared into the throng of dancers. The envelope sat untouched, a useless weight on the mahogany. He stood alone, the silence of his own wealth closing in around him. The city did not wake up. It simply hardened. Gray light bled through the smog, turning the streets into a landscape of sharp angles and cold concrete. Adrian sat in the back of his sedan, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic vibration that felt like a pulse. He had been there since 4 in the morning. The leather seats were cool, the air inside the vehicle sterile and filtered, a stark contrast to the damp, biting wind swirling outside. He watched the entrance of the apartment block across the street, his gaze fixed on the heavy iron door. He was not looking for a business deal or a leverage point. He was looking for her. Every passerby who emerged from the shadows drew his immediate, predatory attention, only to be dismissed with a flick of his eyes. He checked his watch, the glow of the dial reflecting in his pupils, then looked back at the door. When it finally swung open, the sound was lost to the city traffic, but he saw her immediately. She stepped onto the pavement, her head bowed against the wind. Adrian leaned forward, his hands tightening on the armrest. The distance between them was only 30 feet, but it felt like a chasm he was finally preparing to cross. He watched her movements and felt the familiar, cold certainty of his life begin to fray. The sedan remained motionless, a dark anchor in the morning rush. Adrian watched through the tinted glass as the scene unfolded on the cracked pavement. A man in a heavy coat stood inches from Valentina, his finger jabbing at the air, his face twisted into a mask of demand. He was shouting, the sound muffled by the glass, but the intent was clear. Valentina did not retreat. She stood firm, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. As the man stepped closer, invading her space, she countered with a sharp, sweeping motion of her hands. She was not pleading. She was stating terms. Her jaw was set, her head held high, and every time the man tried to loom over her, she pushed back into his space with a sudden, forceful gesture that made him stumble. The sidewalk became a theater of resistance. Commuters swerved around them, but she ignored the crowd, her focus entirely on the man blocking her path. She pointed toward the street, then back at the cafe, her movements precise and jagged. She was a wall of resolve in the face of a rising tide. Adrian felt the grip of his own composure slipping. He had expected a victim, but he was witnessing a force that refused to be diminished by the threat of displacement. The landlord stepped forward, his shadow engulfing her, his hand slamming against the brick wall beside her head. He was shouting now, his voice rising above the hum of the morning traffic. He held up a set of keys, dangling them just out of reach, a final ultimatum meant to snap her resolve. Valentina did not flinch. She leaned into the space he had created, her eyes locked on his, her hands moving with a rhythmic, sharp intensity that cut through his bluster. She pointed to the ground, then to the door, refusing to acknowledge the power he thought he held over her existence. The man's face turned a deep, mottled red, his frustration mounting as his threats failed to produce the expected fear. He grabbed for her arm, but she twisted away, with a fluid, practiced motion, stepping back into the center of the sidewalk. She stood her ground, chest heaving, her posture radiating a defiance. Adrian watched from the sedan, his breath hitching in his throat. The raw, unyielding nature of her resistance struck him with the force of a physical blow. The landlord retreated, muttering, his posture slumped as he turned away toward the corner. Valentina remained in the center of the sidewalk, her hands dropping to her sides, her shoulders finally sagging as the adrenaline ebbed. Inside the sedan, Adrian did not move. He watched her wipe a stray lock of hair from her forehead, her gaze scanning the street with a lingering, sharp intensity. He had spent years viewing the world as a game of leverage, a map of people to be bought or broken. He looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, then back at her. The transaction he had planned felt hollow, a relic of a strategy that no longer applied. She was not a prize to be acquired or a debt to be settled. She was a force that matched his own, a mirror reflecting the same iron will he used to command his empire. He felt the static of the club return, that thin, charged air that made his skin prickle. The realization settled in his chest, heavy and absolute. He was not looking at a subordinate, he was looking at an equal. He reached for the door handle, his grip firm, his pulse steadying into a rhythm of singular, unwavering purpose. The door of the sedan opened with a sharp metallic click that sliced through the morning noise. Adrian stepped out, his feet hitting the cold pavement with a rhythmic, heavy finality. Commuters on the sidewalk stumbled, their hurried pace faltering as they caught sight of him. A man carrying a briefcase veered sharply into a lamppost, his eyes widening in recognition, while a group of students froze mid-stride. Adrian ignored them all. He did not glance at the faces turning toward him or the murmurs rippling through the crowd. His focus was a singular, narrow beam directed entirely at the figure standing near the cafe entrance. He moved with a predatory grace, his gait steady and unhurried despite the chaos he left in his wake. He walked forward, his presence pulling the oxygen from the air, closing the gap with the precision of a man who had finally found his target. He stopped 3 paces from her. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete. Valentina shifted her weight, her eyes narrowing as she registered the intrusion. She took a half step to the left, intending to bypass him, but he mirrored the movement with a subtle, fluid shift of his own. He blocked her path completely. She stopped, her breath hitching, her hands balling into fists at her sides. The surrounding chatter of the street seemed to drop away, replaced by the low, steady hum of traffic that felt miles away. She looked up at him, her chin tilted in a challenge, but the words she had ready for the landlord died in her throat. He did not speak. She tried to step back, but her heel caught on the uneven edge of the curb. She steadied herself, her gaze locked onto his. He remained motionless, his presence anchoring the space, forcing her to acknowledge that the morning had shifted into something entirely new. Adrian did not blink. The silence stretched, a taut wire vibrating between them, until he finally broke it. His voice was low, stripped of the polished veneer he wore at the club. "I have already made up my mind," he said. The words hung in the cold morning air, stark and absolute. He leaned in, his eyes scanning her face, searching for a tremor, a flicker of doubt, any crack in the armor she had spent years forging. He saw her jaw tighten, her breath catching in her throat, but she did not look away. "I want you, and only you," he continued, his tone devoid of any request or negotiation. No one else. He watched the way her hands trembled, just once, before she forced them still. He was looking for a weakness, a point of entry into the fortress she had built around her life, but he found only a mirror of his own stubborn resolve. He held his position, his presence a physical weight pressing against her, waiting for the moment her defiance would finally falter. He took a half-step closer, closing the final gap until his presence was all she could see. "Because to me, you are my kind of perfect." The words were not a command. They were a confession, stripped of the calculated leverage he had used to rule his world for a decade. He felt the cold mask of his indifference fracture, the stone facade finally giving way to a raw, unbidden need. He stood exposed, his hands hanging at his sides, no longer reaching for power or control. The city noise, the grinding gears of a bus, the distant sirens faded into a dull, meaningless hum. He watched her face, searching for the impact of his surrender, and for the first time in his life, he felt the terrifying weight of uncertainty. He had built an empire on the assumption that every soul had a price. But looking at her, he realized he was the one being bought. He simply waited, his breathing shallow, his gaze locked onto hers with a desperate, quiet intensity. The air between them was heavy with the silence of a man who had finally let go of his own detachment. Valentina felt the air leave her lungs in a sharp, ragged intake. His words were not just a statement. They were a breach in the walls she had constructed to keep her life separate from the chaos of his. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the mundane street corner, the cracked sidewalk, the smell of burnt coffee from the cafe, the impatient honking of a delivery truck seemed to dissolve. In its place, the cold, calculated gravity of his world began to bleed through. She saw the shadow he cast, long and dark, stretching across the pavement to swallow the space where she stood. The reality of his influence was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical weight pressing against her, demanding a response she was not prepared to give. She watched his hand, steady and unmoving, hovering in the space between them. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to retreat, to turn back toward the cafe, and the familiar grinding struggle of her daily life. But the static in the air held her fast. She was no longer just a spectator to his power. She was the focal point of it. The boundary between her desperate, quiet existence and the high-stakes world he commanded had finally collapsed, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her own resolve. Valentina looked past his shoulder at the cafe, at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter and the landlord waiting by the door. That life was a fragile, fraying thread, and he had just pulled it taut. She understood then that the choice was not between staying or leaving, but between the slow erosion of her spirit and the sudden, violent storm he brought with him. She looked down at her hands, calloused and stained, then back up at his face. The power he wielded was a physical pressure, a weight that made the very air feel dense and unyielding. She did not flinch. She did not step back. Instead, she squared her shoulders, the movement sharp and decisive. She was choosing to step into the void, to trade the certainty of her struggle for the terrifying momentum of his orbit. The city continued to churn around them, indifferent to the collision, but the street corner had become a vacuum. She felt the last of her resistance drain away, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. Adrian moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied the intensity of the moment. He reached out, his hand steady as it bridged the final inches between them. He did not grab or force. He simply extended his fingers until they rested against the curve of her cheek. The contact was electric, a sudden point of warmth against the cool morning air. Beneath his skin, he felt the pulse of her hesitation, a rapid, frantic rhythm that mirrored his own internal upheaval. For years, he had operated behind a wall of absolute control, a structure built on the belief that nothing could touch him. But as his thumb traced the line of her jaw, he felt the first hairline crack form deep within his chest. It was a physical sensation, a sharp, jagged snap. The indifference he had cultivated for decades began to splinter, falling away in heavy, unrecoverable shards. He looked at her, truly seeing the defiance and the fear that mirrored his own hidden vulnerabilities. He simply held his ground, watching as the rigid architecture of his life collapsed, leaving behind only the raw, exposed reality of his choice. Valentina did not pull away. She stood motionless, the morning wind tugging at her hair, but her gaze remained locked on his. As his fingers traced the curve of her face, she tilted her head, a subtle, involuntary movement that pressed her skin deeper into his palm. The tension that had defined her posture for years evaporated, replaced by a heavy, quiet stillness. She closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the city noise faded into a dull, distant hum. This was the point of no return. She felt the warmth of his hand, a stark contrast to the biting chill of the pavement beneath her feet. When she opened her eyes, the defiance was gone, replaced by a raw, unflinching awareness of the path ahead. Adrian did not withdraw. He held the contact, his own breathing shallow, his focus narrowed entirely to the space between them. She reached up, her own hand hovering briefly before she rested her fingers against his wrist. It was a silent pact, a physical anchor in the chaos he had brought into her life. The ice had fractured, and now the flood began. The morning sun crested the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. Adrian pulled his hand back, but the space between them remained charged. He looked toward his idling car, then back at the woman who had dismantled his certainty with a single look. He reached for the handle of the sedan door, paused, and let it fall shut. The engine died, leaving the street in a sudden, profound quiet. He stood tall, his shoulders dropping from their habitual defensive tension. The mask of indifference he had worn for decades was gone, replaced by a gaze that finally held depth. Valentina watched him, her own breathing syncing with the rhythm of the rising day. The shards of the life he had built, the leverage, the silence, the cold distance fell away like ice melting under direct heat. He did not look back at the empire he had spent a lifetime constructing. He looked only at her. They turned together and walked away from the curb, leaving the shadow of the car behind as the morning light swallowed the last traces of his old, frozen world.